The valley shimmered with light as morning sun hit the wet rice paddies of Tuy Hoa. Water buffalo waded through the fields. Farmers moved silently, bent beneath the weight of baskets and the pressure of a war they didn't choose. From above, the land looked calm, rows of green paddies bordered by thatched roof villages and winding dirt roads. But beneath the surface, the calm was a lie. Beneath the village floors and bamboo huts, trenches and tunnels stretched like veins, feeding the heart of an unseen enemy. The North Vietnamese Army's 18B Regiment had made Phu Yen their new stronghold, and they had no intention of giving it up. Every hill, every tree line, every irrigation trench, fortified, mapped, and primed for ambush. American intelligence confirmed what the locals already feared. The Viet Cong were preparing to seize the upcoming rice harvest, which would be more valuable than gold for fueling their logistics network. The entire Tuy Hoa Valley risked falling completely into enemy hands. So command made a decision. Operation Van Buren was launched. If you're into forgotten battles and the brutal reality of Vietnam, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. This story isn't just about a fight, it's about an entire valley turned battlefield, where mud, sweat, and fire determined who lived through the harvest season. By mid-January 1966, orders were already moving through the ranks of the 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division. These weren't fresh recruits. They were the Screaming Eagles, veterans of firefights from the Central Highlands to the Mekong. Now they were being inserted into a landscape both wide open and dangerously close-quartered. Their mission: locate and destroy enemy positions before the NVA could take the rice. Joining them were the feared soldiers of the South Korean Capital Division, a battle-hardened ally with a ruthless reputation, and elements of the ARVN, who would provide intelligence, manpower, and local knowledge. The plan was simple on paper: sweep through the valley, clear the hamlets, eliminate entrenched forces, and secure the harvest. But Phu Yen wasn't just a farming province. It was a battlefield waiting to awaken. The first air mobile elements lifted off from staging areas near the coast. UH-1 Hueys roared across the sky, blades cutting the humid air as they carried platoons toward landing zones west of the valley. Below them, the terrain unfolded like a trap. Broken lines of jungle, rice fields flooded with ankle-deep water, and villages that could either be friendly or fatal. No one expected a clean mission. Every officer and enlisted man knew this wasn't going to be a simple patrol. It was going to be a war of inches, measured in blood. As the first boots hit the mud just before dawn, birds scattered from the trees, and the sound of the choppers faded into the distance. The valley for a moment was silent again. But that silence wouldn't last. Not here. Not in Phu Yen. Maps lay spread across folding tables under a canvas tent. Dirty fingers traced red pencil lines around clusters of villages. Recon patrols had confirmed it. My Phu and Phu and Anthak weren't just population centers. They were fortresses, camouflaged by palm trees and clay huts. Captured documents from an earlier skirmish near Canton revealed an unsettling layout: interlocking trenches, reinforced bunkers, and designated firing lanes. My Phu, especially, was marked as a logistical anchor point. It wasn't just a place to hide. It was where the 18B Regiment stored food, weapons, and men. Intelligence estimated a full battalion was stationed in the area. Maybe more. The Americans weren't just chasing guerrillas anymore. They were approaching a conventional enemy, dug in and disciplined. Scouts returned with first-hand accounts. One reported a hamlet lined with narrow ditches too clean to be natural. Another found a collapsed tunnel entrance with fresh tool marks on the inside. At a nearby pond, footprints circled the banks. Infantry-level movement, not villagers fetching water. Orders came down from Brigade Command: engage My Phu head-on. It was too important to bypass. The objective: seize it, clear it, and break the regiment's defensive backbone in the valley. South Korean units moved along the western ridgeline to cover any retreat routes. ARVN teams worked to isolate nearby hamlets and set up blocking positions. The Americans would go in first. Troops prepared silently. Ammo checked, gear tightened, dog tags tucked under shirts. No speeches, no guarantees. Just a cold understanding: if the enemy decided to stand and fight here, it would be a bloodbath. Night patrols intensified. At dusk, flares lit the horizon, and artillery strikes softened suspected enemy zones along the tree lines. One recon team, moving through the outer edge of My Phu, triggered an explosion that blew a sergeant off his feet. His squad pulled back under covering fire. No enemy returned fire. They didn't need to. Early morning February 6th, the assault would begin within hours. Overhead, F-100 jets circled in holding patterns, armed with napalm and cluster munitions. Artillery crews calculated coordinates down to the meter. Helicopters stood by for medical evacuation. Every man knew what it meant. This wasn't a sweep. This was an assault. In the calm before the clash, one soldier knelt beside a paddy and whispered a prayer. Another pulled a photo from his helmet band, his wife and daughter back home in Georgia. There were no words between them, just nods, tight grips, and eyes fixed on the village ahead. My Phu didn't look like a fortress from a distance, just another quiet hamlet, ringed by palms and smoke curling from cooking fires. But beneath that calm, the enemy was waiting. The sky over My Phu was heavy with low clouds and smoke from distant artillery. Just past dawn, Company B, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, moved out in two staggered columns, skirting the edges of irrigation ditches and keeping to the rice paddy berms. Ahead lay the village, silent, undisturbed, and wrong. The locals had vanished. No movement, no animals, no sound. It looked empty, but everyone knew better. At the tree line, the point man signaled a halt. His boot had bumped something hard buried in the mud. A wire. He waved over the engineer, who knelt and cleared the dirt. An anti-personnel mine rigged with a pressure trigger. Just one. Probably not alone. 3 more steps forward, and it began. Automatic fire burst from a trench concealed beneath a collapsed hut, stitching the first man in line across the chest. His body fell limp into the water. Then came the mortars. 3 launched in quick succession, walking their explosions across the American advance. Dirt, blood, and shrapnel filled the air. The men dove into whatever cover they could find, behind water buffalo dikes, inside flooded ditches, under fallen palms. Mud coated everything. The enemy positions were invisible until they fired. Company B was pinned. Rifle squads attempted to flank left, but the trench system wrapped around the entire northern edge of My Phu, with firing holes disguised as termite mounds and collapsed walls. From one angle, they saw flashes of muzzle fire. From another, the barrels had vanished. Medics crawled through ankle-deep water, pulling wounded men by their straps. One called out for help, dragging a corporal who was screaming and clutching what was left of his leg. A sniper silenced him with a single shot. Captain Robert Jackson radioed for support. Artillery from a fire base 4 kilometers away responded fast. White phosphorus and HE shells pounded the western edge of the village. The blast shook the trees and carved craters in the fields, but the entrenched enemy stayed locked in. F-100 Super Sabres screamed overhead. Napalm dropped in thick orange streaks, engulfing huts and trench lines. The heat blew back on the Americans still stuck on the perimeter, singeing uniforms and skin. The smell of burning thatch and flesh filled the air. Still, the enemy held. Jackson ordered a squad to charge the nearest bunker. They crossed 40 meters of open ground under fire. 2 were cut down immediately. The others reached the structure, lobbed grenades inside, then cleared it room by room. Inside, they found maps, radios, and stacked rice bags labeled with NVA markings, proof that My Phu was no temporary camp. Another platoon pushed from the east, managing to breach a second trench system by using white smoke and suppressive fire. The fight devolved into hand grenades and close-quarters gunfire. At one point, a U.S. soldier wrestled a Viet Cong fighter into a drainage ditch and killed him with a bayonet. By late afternoon, helicopters arrived with resupply, ammo, morphine, water. One bird hovered too low and took a hit to its tail rotor. It spun sideways and slammed into a rice field, killing the pilot and 2 crewmen instantly. But the pressure was working. By 1600 hours, the trench fire slackened. Bodies littered the village. Over 100 NVA fighters lay dead, many still in firing positions, rifles gripped in their hands. A few survivors had fled through escape tunnels carved beneath bamboo fences, dragging the wounded behind them. The Americans held the village, but at a cost. 21 soldiers from Company B lay dead. Dozens more wounded. The village was wrecked. What hadn't been burned by napalm had been torn apart by artillery and small arms. A baby's crib sat in the corner of one hut, untouched, while the wall behind it was caved in from a shell. The survivors moved silently through the ruins, checking bodies, retrieving dog tags, reloading magazines. The adrenaline was gone, replaced with exhaustion and a hollow ache in the chest. My Phu was secure, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like survival. Charlie Company stepped past the burnt-out huts, boots squelching in blackened mud, their eyes locked forward, not lingering on the aftermath. There wasn't time to grieve. Orders pushed them west, toward the neighboring hamlets of Van Phu and Thach, where reports of movement had come in just hours after the last shots fell. The Viet Cong didn't linger in defeat. They shifted, dissolved, reappeared somewhere else, often just a mile away. In the wake of My Phu, enemy resistance became unpredictable. Some villages were empty, others were laced with explosives. At An Thach, soldiers found booby-trapped rice bags inside a schoolhouse. One exploded as a squad leader lifted it, killing him instantly and wounding two more. Inside the building's floorboards, engineers discovered a hidden tunnel, barely wide enough to crawl through, leading to a storage room with crates of ammunition and ration tins marked in Chinese. The enemy had buried themselves into the civilian landscape so deeply that every door opened with a held breath. To the west, South Korean troops pressed hard into jungle flanks, driving out scattered pockets of resistance. Their tactics were direct. No warning shots, no half measures. Villages under their control stayed quiet, if tense. The ARVN held crossroads and rear supply lines, manning checkpoints and collecting intelligence from the few civilians who dared to speak. But the deeper the Americans pushed into Phu Yen, the more surreal the fight became. One day might pass in silence. The next would erupt with fire from a thicket that looked like any other. A patrol crossing a narrow causeway was ambushed from a camouflaged raft bunker on the riverbank. A soldier spotted the muzzle flash in time, and a nearby M60 gunner returned fire, riddling the structure and sending the enemy diving into the water. Back at the battalion command post, the mood remained tense. Every cleared village was a temporary gain, not a permanent one. The harvest hadn't yet begun in full, but the rice paddies were swelling, green and gold across the valley. That was the target. Not the villages, not the soldiers, the rice. Daily sweeps continued. Flame teams burned empty bunkers. Engineers collapsed tunnel entrances with C4. Artillery units adjusted fire grids to cover likely fallback zones. Still, the Viet Cong kept slipping through. Traces left behind, cooking fires, fresh footprints, torn uniforms near stream beds, reminded everyone that the enemy wasn't gone, just elsewhere, just waiting. The 101st had been in the valley for weeks now. Their uniforms were caked in dust and smoke. Their sleep came in fits, broken by the thud of mortars and the hum of generators. But the mission hadn't changed. Clear the valley, secure the harvest, deny the enemy his lifeline. And somewhere ahead, the final days of Operation Van Buren were already forming. Just beyond the next village, just beyond the next ambush. By late February, the rhythm of combat began to slow. Not because the enemy was gone, but because he had faded again, as he always did. One by one, the firefight stopped. The ambushes became rare, the traps less frequent. In the space of a week, entire sectors of the Tuy Hoa Valley fell silent. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like being watched. Command declared the objectives met. The rice-growing regions had been cleared. Enemy fortifications were reduced to smoldering craters and collapsed trenches. The 101st had secured all priority hamlets, with over 300 confirmed enemy killed and large quantities of weapons and supplies captured or destroyed. What they couldn't take was certainty. Entire squads moved through newly cleared areas with the same tension as day one. A field that was calm in the morning could explode by dusk. Soldiers joked less. They checked every doorway, cleared every chicken coop. They never walked the same path twice. One morning, a farmer returned to his burned village, carrying a woven bag and leading a child by the hand. Behind him came others, families emerging from the hills and jungle, drawn by hunger and the scent of extinguished fire. The army gave out rice, medics treated the sick, engineers bulldozed the remnants of bunkers. But for the villagers, it was hard to tell who had saved what and for whose benefit. The ARVN took over static security posts as the Americans pulled back. South Korean forces repositioned westward. A final sweep by the 101st uncovered one last cache buried in a graveyard. AK-47s, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath false stones. On February 25, 1966, Operation Van Buren officially ended. The helicopters returned, engines screaming against the stillness. Platoons loaded up, mud-streaked and exhausted, sitting shoulder to shoulder without speaking. Just a few miles away, the rice paddies rippled in the wind, green stalks nearly ready for harvest. Trucks from Saigon rolled in under ARVN escort to claim the grain, load it, and haul it back to government-controlled depots. But some men couldn't leave. 21 soldiers from Company B never boarded a helicopter again. Their names were being etched into casualty reports and telegrams sent to families back home. Others left behind pieces of themselves in ways harder to see, fragments of bone, sleepless nights, a silence they'd carry for the rest of their lives. As the last Huey lifted off, its rotor wash kicked up a storm of dust and ash. The valley faded behind them, just another patch of war-torn earth from the air. But down below, the jungle was already growing back, and in its shade the enemy would return, because they always did. The bodies buried, the trenches filled, the rice loaded onto trucks under ARVN guard. On paper, Operation Van Buren was a success. The harvest was saved. The valley was cleared. Hundreds of enemy fighters were killed or scattered. But success in Vietnam was always temporary. Weeks after the last helicopter lifted off, Viet Cong units slipped back into the Tuy Hoa Valley. Not in battalions, not in daylight, but in twos and threes, at night, through tunnels no one had found. They returned to rebuild what had been lost, to threaten what had just been won. Some villagers helped. Others simply looked away. The 101st moved on to the next operation, the next province, the next stretch of jungle. But for those who fought at My Phu, who crawled through the mud and watched friends fall in the smoke, the valley never really stayed behind. It lingered, in the smell of burnt rice stalks, in the weight of dog tags in a pocket, in the quiet that followed the firefight. Phu Yen had been a battlefield, a trap, and a message. Clear the land, take the grain, bury the enemy, and then do it again somewhere else. Thanks for watching. If this kind of raw, untold combat history speaks to you, make sure to like the video and hit that subscribe button. We've got more forgotten operations, more boots-on-the-ground stories, and more of the brutal truth behind battles that changed lives, even if they didn't make the headlines. Until next time, stay sharp.